So, this happened back in the summer of 2017 in Port Orchard, Washington. I was just chilling with my friends at the local park in our city. Now, this park was pretty popular. Lots of people go there, but this was seen in Washington, and it was raining, and there was a huge storm, and so nobody was there except for me and my friends. So, it was getting pretty late, and we decided to go to my house. When we got there, nobody was home, and it was really quiet. I didn't really take note of how quiet it was because, well, when we went inside, we were all being really loud. But usually, the house is never that quiet. Anyway, me and my friends sit on the couch and we start playing Xbox. We play it for about 4 hours, and in that time, the storm had gotten progressively worse. But we didn't think much of it. As I said before, this is Washington. But we're about to play a different game on the Xbox when I heard a noise come from somewhere around the house. I didn't think much of it, but then I heard it again. Only this time, much more distinctive sounding. Like a metal chair being drug on a floor. But here's the thing. It came from the basement. That's when I asked my friends if they had heard it. They said no, so I put it off as me imagining things. I mean, I was tired, and that's when I heard it again. But this time, my friends heard it too. So we all paused, waiting for it to happen again, and when it did, it was way louder, way more fierce as it happened. And like a cliche in a horror movie, the power goes out. We all flipped the hell out, and we're about to pull out our phones, shining it around, freaking out. But we couldn't see. I mean, it was pitch black. I then remembered I had a flashlight hiding under my living room table, so I felt my way back to it and grabbed the flashlight. So I'm shining it around, and I realized that one of my friends was gone. So I was asking the others if they had seen him, and so after a couple of minutes of searching for him, we say that, all right, this isn't funny. We're calling his name, we don't hear any trace of him. But there's a very faint noise. And we're upstairs, remind you, at this time, and so we go downstairs, and we yell for him again, still hearing this faint noise. And we hear his voice. That faint sound that we were hearing was his voice. He was responding to our calls, and you'll never guess where we were hearing him from. The basement. We all look at each other, and we realize, all right, guys, either he's pranking us, or something really freaky is going on. One of us had to go down there and find him. After minutes arguing amongst ourselves, we all decided we would go down there together. When we got to the top of the basement, we felt this freezing breeze come at us, sending shivers all down our spines. But, we had to suck it up, and we started our descent into the basement. In the meanwhile, we're yelling for our missing friend, and he says yes. Now, before I go any further, here's my basement. It is huge and is divided into 3 different sections. One, that leads to the stairs, is a big square and the shape of a square. The second one is a really small rectangular long hallway. And the next part is similar to the first section. Once we got to the bottom of the stairs, it's below freezing. But we kept moving and searching around, searching the entirety of the first section. He didn't turn up, so we looked down the hallway, calling for him, and we could hear him calling from the other room, saying, I'm here, I'm here. But his voice sounded different. So we walked all the way, very slowly through the hallway, for what felt like hours, walking down, and we make it to the final part of the basement, which was the longest and by far the creepiest. But it was so long that when we shined the flashlight into it, the light didn't hit a wall. But anyway, we kept yelling for our friend again, and he answered, but his voice kept changing more and more. It kept sounding deeper and deeper than what his voice actually sounds like. We thought it must be the acoustics or something. So we brushed it off, and we started entering the last section. We all got out of the hallway and started searching. We get to the end, and there's a part of the room where there's a ton of boxes. So we're shining our light on the boxes and start going towards them, when we hear our friend, or at least what we thought was our friend, say, in only what I can describe as a demonic, pure evil, more than scary shriek. I heard one of my friends run away immediately, back up the stairs, and me and the last friend that I was with looked and got close to the boxes. And I see these horns. I stopped, but they raised up more and more till I saw the entire body crouching, so it didn't hit the roof of my basement. It was easily taller than the tallest of the roof of the basement. That's when my other friend and I ran, but I felt stuck. I mean, this thing, it locked eyes with me, and I felt like it was staring me down, taking my soul, rather than my friend coming back. He grabs me. This thing shrieked and it was loud. As if it went any higher, it could have broken the windows. So we book it back to the stairs, and as we're running back up the stairs, we hear these huge stomping steps coming after us. We get to the top of the stairs, and it went quiet. My other friends were getting their stuff packed and about to leave, and so I'm asking them, could you please stay? Could you please stay? Can I go somewhere? I need to do something. So they went to the room to grab my stuff, and I went into the living room. And by that point, my other friends were in their car waiting to get me out of there. And I hear that same sound from the deep, demonic voice in the basement. I grabbed my charger and I left, and I did not even lock the door. When I wake up the next morning at my friend's house, I called my original friend, the one who went missing yesterday, that we all looked for. And he told us he went home shortly after the power had gone out. We all flipped out. Let's just say we never went into that basement again. And I moved shortly after to an apartment, hoping I don't ever see that thing, whatever it was. So, this happened to me the day before yesterday. Me and my parents went to our grandma's home in a suburban town in northeastern India, known as Rudeswar. For context, I'm a skeptic and a believer, maybe a hybrid of both. I need to see it well to believe it. Since the weather's being really hot these days, it was no surprise that the house was scorching hot too. Me and my parents were made to sleep in the living room, with me on one bed and my mom and dad on the other, just across the room. Keep in mind that the living room is the first room you enter when you do enter the house through the front door, and the house was also one story on the ground level. There was not enough ceiling fans because some of the fans weren't working due to a short circuit with the interior or electrical line. So, throughout the night, we struggled to sleep as there was only one ceiling fan between beds. Here comes the scary stuff. So, after many struggles to sleep, due to hotness and mosquitoes, I finally fell asleep, and then I wake up at 4 a.m. My parents were awake too. Since it was almost morning, my parents decided to open the front door for ventilation. Windows weren't an option since they were directly open to bushes in the side of the house with a lot of mosquitoes. And keep in mind that my bed can be seen directly from the road through the front door. So, after opening, we sat and waited for the room to cool down. Then, I heard it sounded like a pail. If you don't know, it's a short anklet that Indian women wear. I didn't pay attention to it, as I've heard this sound before when I wake up at midnight. I don't know why I didn't pay attention. Maybe I was falling asleep. The sound from the front yard to the left side of the house, and it repeated as somebody was walking. It sounded like one on one leg, not a pair on both. So, after 5 minutes of this, my mom called me to sit on the couch and not on the bed. There is a rule in India that if you come face to face with a paranormal entity, or whatever it is, you will have a bad night. So, no one wanted you to check it out. So I sat on the couch and my parents were discussing about it. Me and my dad said that it might be a bird or an insect, but my mom wasn't buying it. She said that she kept hearing these sounds since she was a child. I have heard my grandma say this before too. Keep in mind that my grandma and my baby cousin, sisters, wear these as well, and no one else does, and they were both asleep. I confirmed it by checking it. So, after 15-ish minutes of this, it finally stopped. Then, I swear, when I say this, I'm not kidding. Just like the boom sound of insects in nature, here this comes just right after that. Let me tell you that my grandma and others also pointed it out, that the thing has been doing this for many years, and the route is in front or side to front to back. It's not a regular thing, but it isn't rare. As mentioned earlier, I have heard this sound before, but I've always ignored it. That may be because it's not scary, but after this incident, I definitely have a different perspective. My family members believe it's a deity, or at least a good entity. Well, I believe that too because it wasn't threatening. As per my speculation, I can't explain it. You have to be in my position to understand that in that house, I had a weird thing. A seriously flippin' weird thing happened to us. I don't think it was an insect or a bird or even a snake. They don't just roam around in the same path, and the sound of an anklet is too distinct. I was able to see the front yard even from the road, and my bed clearly as it was almost morning. So there was some light in the sky, and the porch light is on to always distract away the mosquitoes. If somebody did come to the front yard, I would have seen it. So it wasn't a prank. And I can't explain the sudden boom of sounds of nature. I think it was something more. Something dark. It's very rare that I wonder what would have happened had we opened the window. Don't. I repeat, do not go to the Ashland motel off of exit 72. I'm writing to you all as a warning. Something I wished I had gotten before my visit. A bit of backstory about me, as this will be important later. I'm 18 years old and I have to drive out of state to visit my girlfriend, as we both met online. This drive usually takes around an hour and a half to an hour and 15 minutes on a good, clear night. This was one of those nights. I was cruising down the empty freeway, and the lights of a car on the opposite side flashes occasionally. I was listening to some quiet music, taking in the surroundings and enjoying the cool wind blowing in through the now sunroof. I'll be honest, I was not paying as much attention to the road as I should have. I was tired and sick of sticking to my leather seats. So, I pulled over to the right side of the road and got out to stretch my legs. I left my car running, and I wanted to make sure that I could see in front of me with the headlights, just in case anything came out of the woods. By anything, I mean bobcats and bears. Nothing supernatural. It's not that I didn't believe in the supernatural. I just hadn't experienced anything supernatural. Until now. I was parked on the side of the freeway, standing to the right of my car, staring at the pitch-black forest and just listening to the sounds of the night. I really don't know why I did it, but something told me that I should look around. Something was off. That's when I saw it. The billboard. It was one of the roadside signs, the expensive ones that the big businesses used to advertise. The backdrop was faded blue, with very pale yellow writing on top of it. The text said Ashland Motel, Exit 72. There was nothing inadvertently wrong with this sign. It was so basic and lacking, but something was off. The billboard could not be seen from the road. Trees covered it just the right way, making it impossible unless you were pulled over in this exact spot, looking this exact way. Maybe it's just an old sign nobody took down, I told myself. There's nothing wrong with an old motel sign. The place is probably gone by now. I felt like that wasn't right, but it was pure gut feeling. So, I wanted to investigate a little further. But my body would not move, and my legs felt like lead and jelly at the same time. I mustered the courage to take a few steps forward, and that's when I saw the text at the very bottom. Vacancy since 2020. I don't know why, but these words sent such a disgusting feeling into my stomach. The sign was altered recently. So why was it so hidden? What purpose did the sign hold if it wasn't meant to be seen by the public? I felt so sick, I just started vomiting off the side of the road. It was uncontrollable. This sign was absolutely the reason for it. When I was sure that I had emptied out the contents of my stomach, plus a little more, I ran back to my car and jumped in. I've never locked a car door so fast, and trust me, I'm not a religious man, but I prayed that my car would start and I could just drive 90 miles an hour home, as far away from this motel as possible. My 1999 Toyota turned over, and the fear in my stomach began building again. I stopped turning the key and waited for a second, hoping a brake would help start the car. I looked around, and for a split second, I saw him. He was tall, featureless, shaded by the night. His silhouette was pure black. It seemed to even consume the moonlight. So, it was obvious this wasn't just a tree or plant or animal. This, what I was looking at, was otherworldly. I wrenched the key in the ignition again, and after desperate pleas to whatever God was out there, it sputtered and started. I slammed my foot on the gas, tires squealing, and I got away from that Ashford motel sign. Now, this was 2 weeks ago. The Ashford motel sign had haunted my mind every day. I told 2 of my friends about this experience. I didn't want them to think I was crazy, so I left the bit about the tall man out. They, of course, wanted to find the motel. I begged them not to, that it wasn't meant to be found and we should just leave it like that. They told me that they were going, with or without me. Me, being the overthinker and constant anxiety-ridden boy I am, I couldn't think of them to let them go without me, just in case something happened and I wasn't there. We left after dinner time, around 5 p.m. The sun was setting, which made me even more nervous, so I put the Ashland motel into Google Maps. Nothing. I looked it up on Google. Nothing. I even searched Facebook for a while, looking for an address or some sort of business page, and only found one post talking about the motel. And the post read this: The Ashland Motel, 5 stars, safe room, and lively staff. Which, honestly, sounded like somebody who was trying to make you think of something while meaning something different. My friends gave me a slap on the back and told me that I was overthinking it again. I laughed nervously and agreed, although nothing about this was funny. We ended up putting exit 72 in the GPS, and it took us there. I made my way to Ethan Drive. I didn't want to have to sit behind the wheel if that man came back. It took us roughly 35 minutes to get to exit 72, and we got off right away. Immediately, I had a bad feeling. The motel wasn't in sight at all, and I was sure that it would not be, especially because of the placement of that sign. I didn't mention this, though. I didn't want to find the motel, but sadly, Ethan remembered my comment about the sign being invisible from the street and decided to just start pulling down behind driveways and gravel roads. We searched for a while until Will, my other friend in the back seat, told Ethan to stop the car. He had seen something through the trees, a small building hidden in the woods. We reversed slowly until we all saw it. The rectangular building hidden by the forest, and a sign reading Ashland Motel in front. My stomach felt sick. The words were the same pale yellow text, somehow looking more faded than the sign on the freeway. There didn't seem to be a road leading to the motel, meaning we would have to park the car and walk through the woods to get to it. I begged my friends not to go. We had seen the motel, we could leave. It exists, all right. I warned them about bobcats and bears and ticks and bear traps. Nothing seemed to shake their drive to investigate further. I knew that I had to go. If that man appeared, I knew that they wouldn't be able to shake off the fear the same way that I would be able to. Well, we all grabbed a torch from the back seat of Ethan's car and began our trek into the woods. The motel was set back about 100 or so yards, and there was no clear-cut path leading to it. We had to shine our flashlights at the ground and make sure we didn't fall into a large hole or step on a venomous snake. With each footfall, a branch would snap, and leaves would rustle under us. Finally, we made it to a clearing, and I wanted to run back as soon as we had arrived. The building was a pale yellow, with a brown roof that obviously hasn't been cleaned in a long time, if ever. We stood at what seemed to be the front of a motel, but there were no signs or roads to even guide us. Look, the best way I can describe it, the motel seemed to have dropped from the sky, removing all the trees under it, and just sitting there for years. The grass was overgrown, and there were vines growing over the lattice, moss on the doors. There was about 10 rooms total. Each of the doors were separated by a window and a small empty pot. I was heavily analyzing the motel, speculating the reason for its placement, when I had the same feeling I did at the sign. My stomach lurched, and I placed my elbows on my knees. Ethan tapped my shoulder. I didn't move. He tapped me again harder, but he wouldn't say anything. I looked up at him, and the color had drained out of his face. He was staring at the forest behind the motel, as if he were mystified by that spot. Will was staring back at the car, color drained from his face too. Only then did I realize why they were staring with so much fear. The sounds of branches cracking and leaves crunching were surrounding us. Like 100 people were running in a circle around the motel woods. I whirled around, trying to catch a glimpse of what was making the noise. But it was beyond fast, if it was one thing. I could not catch my breath. I began to hyperventilate and sweat aggressively. I saw Will begin to cry silently, and Ethan began to apologize for killing us. I had to get it together. I knew I did. That's when the urge hit me again. I felt so drawn to it. I couldn't stop my head from turning to face the hotel. I began to sob when I saw them, pale faces, all of them staring at us from the windows of the motel. They were illuminated by something otherworldly, as the rest of the area was pitch black. All the faces had a disgustingly large smile, too large to be human, stretching from ear to ear, each showing too many teeth, all of them perfectly white. The eyes are the reason I'm writing this now. They all had hollow eyes, set into their heads too far back. I realized that I wasn't looking at eyes, but the lack of eyes. All the holes were filled with the same darkness that outlined the man at the motel sign that night. I repressed the need to vomit, but my sobs did not stop. They were deep and uncontrollable. I knew I had to run, even if the thing running around the motel would stop us. I just knew that it was better to deal with that thing than whatever was in the motel. Those faces would do something worse than kill us, and I knew that. I grabbed my friend's arm, and we began running. My vision blurring, the footsteps and crunching got louder and louder. I drowned them out. I could feel myself choking on my own mucus and tears. I screamed to hurry up, and we sprinted deeper into the woods. It felt like we were running through the woods for hours, and the footsteps echoing all around us. Screams flooding my ears, and they were louder than I had ever heard before. Any noise that I'd ever heard. I knew it was coming from the motel. The faces were so terrible and horrible and angry. The screams were loud. We thought we were going to die. As I dragged my friend through the final stretch of woods, the screams finally stopped. The lack of noise itself was deafening, but I knew we were still being chased by the forest thing. I saw the car, a stupid Ford Focus, was the best sight I've ever seen. We had finally made it, and the footsteps stopped. As soon as we make it to the car, I began to let loose and vomit profusely. It felt like I was bleeding from my stomach, and it was too dark for me to check. I couldn't tell if the liquid running down my face was tears, mucus, or blood, and I honestly did not care. Ethan was vomiting aggressively as well, sobbing between hurls, while Will was on the ground in the fetal position, sobbing. I turned around to look back at this motel, and there it was. There it was. The Shadow Man. The one who was at the sign, the one who was staring at me. He was illuminated with the same sinister light that cast upon the windows in the motel, but he was still just as dark as ever. He had no features, he was taller than me, and his presence was sinister. I could tell he was smiling, trying to lure us back. I grabbed my friends and I threw them into the backseat of the car. I didn't want them to see him. I knew they would never forget his darkness. We drove home in silence, and I delivered them home. I got my car from Ethan's house and headed back to my house. No matter what I do, those screams still play in my head, and I could feel his smile on my face. That's why I'm writing this. Does anybody know anything about the Ashland motel? Is it even possible to forget all of this? Will he follow me until I die? I don't want to keep seeing this place. Please, can anybody help me? I'm a 16-year-old female, and growing up, I was never short of any paranormal experiences. My mother's side of the family, who is indigenous, said they believed me to be able to feel the spirits of those no longer with us. As a result, I was a very restless baby, and even spent a lot of my time, early childhood, with many imaginary friends, within the different houses and apartments we lived in. I was born and spent most of my life in Southern California. The particular city in California, where I'm from, is known for having pretty high crime rates, and often gets the reputation of ghetto. But way back in the 60s, when my stepdad's parents immigrated here from Mexico, the land was cheap, and they bought the property where they built the family house on. Soon after completing the house, they had my stepdad, aunts, and uncle. One of my aunts was a rather rebellious young adult who grew up in the 80s during America's infamous drug epidemic, which was also around the same time that my city gained its reputation. Put two and two together, and you guessed it, she became a druggie. Now, there's a separate little shed-like structure next to the back house that was, at the time, my aunt's room. She often invited her friends over and pretty much did every drug under the sun in there. And on one fateful night, her and her friends decided to use, you'll never guess, a Ouija board. I'd like to point out that my stepdad's side of my family has some colonist ancestors and were raised Catholic, while my mom's side is indigenous Mexican and have more spiritual views. Because my grandparents are such devout Catholics, my aunt obviously kept it a secret. That was until strange things began happening around the house. These strange things started in her room, so she intended to keep it a secret and just get baked out of her mind until she felt less and less scared. But very soon after, these strange things began to happen all over the property. But eventually, she did get clean, married, and moved out pretty soon after. But of course, my grandparents and stepdad were still living here. One day, my grandparents had called her to tell her about all the weird things and asked her and her husband over to install cameras, as he was already in that line of work. She, of course, came, and these strange things hit an all-time high. The stove burners all turned on at once. The cabinets began slamming open and closed. Plates fell and shattered against the kitchen floor. My mom and I had just moved in, and I was pretty young at the time, maybe 5 or 6, worried about my grandparents. My mom and I walked in to ask what was going on. What happened next is based off of what my mom told me, as if I have lost consciousness. As soon as I stepped foot in the house, I held my mom's hand harder than I had ever done before and took a sharp intake of breath. I looked at my mom and said, "Mommy, there are bad people here." My mom was shocked, and my aunt was so terrified and feared and full of ridicule that she finally confessed to what had happened that fateful night so many years ago. My grandma nearly fainted, and my grandfather was livid, to say the least. They spent months putting up crosses, praying in both front and back of the house, but never in my aunt's old room, and nobody was occupying it anymore, period. That was until now. My brother has just come home after completing a rather lengthy contract with the U.S. Army, and so we set that room up to be his. However, since he's come home, he's been sleeping in the living room of our house. He was formerly stationed in Germany with the occasional tour in the Middle East, so he stays up pretty late and is adjusting to the time difference. But the living room is right next to my room. When he's on the phone or watching TV, it can become really difficult for me to fall asleep. So, when me and our parents asked him why he hasn't been sleeping in his room, he gave us the answer that something that made our stomachs drop. Weird things keep happening in there, and I keep hearing voices. I don't really know, it just feels creepy and evil, man. My mom has talked to some of our family members who have now provided with white sage. When it arrives here, I will perform a cleaning ritual and cleanse the whole property. This was around 2013. I just graduated from college and was living with my parents again, in a house where weird things were always happening. It was 3 a.m. and I was working as a freelance video editor, editing a lo-fi, very, very bad music video for a local artist on my desk in my bedroom. My back was to the bed behind me. My dog Dash, who's a pit bull lab mix, was lying next to me on the floor, fast asleep. After hours of watching the music video over and over again, and listening to the same song on repeat for days, I decided to mute the edit as I worked on some effects. My headphones still on, mind you. Then, I heard a click. The lamp next to my bed, which had one of those twist switches across the room, turned off, then on again. Dash sat up, noticing instantly. He was staring directly above the lamp, his eyes fixed on something. But since I had my headphones on, I thought I'd just imagine what had happened. Maybe the delirium of being awake that late and working on the same thing constantly was making my head spin. I turned and continued to work, headphones now off, not thinking of really anything at this point other than getting this stupid music video done. Click, 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 click. Off, on, twice. Now, my dog was growling. The hair on the back of his neck was standing, and his gaze had not moved since these clicks began. So, out of reaction, I stared in the direction of the lamp, and a chill had run down my spine. The room had become cold, and now I was frozen. I slowly turned and looked at my laptop. Dash was still growling and slowly now getting up. Click, 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 click. Off, on, off, on, off, on, off, on. Dash began barking, and the light was now flicking on and off repeatedly. So I picked him up, ran out to my sister's room, and just said I'm done, and slept on the floor. The next day, I packed my stuff to the spare room, never sleeping in that room again. This just happened to me. Once I got off work, I went straight to bed, and that was around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I guess you could say I'm a night owl because my job schedule varies all throughout the week. Either I'm working at night or I'm working in the morning. This day, I had to work in the morning, so I stayed up that night earlier. I woke up around 9 p.m. I got to talk to the family, watch some TV, then began getting really tired again. This was around 1 a.m., and I decided to go back to bed. I actually felt the weight of sleeping this time, and once I got my bed ready, I put YouTube on for a little background noise and just started to drift off to sleep. Then, all of a sudden, everything was quiet. I dreamed about waking up in a building I've dreamt about before, but not for a long time. I was laying on a sleeping bag in a decrepit room with no furniture. I wasn't scared, but confused. The door leading outside suddenly swings open, with somebody walking in, then slamming it shut. Then, I was automatically pushed out of the dream as if I was jolted awake. So I'm laying there, thinking maybe I was just experiencing sleep apnea or something and tried to get up, but I couldn't. I couldn't move my arms, my legs. It's like I left my body for the next minute of what I'm about to tell you. I have had experiences with sleep paralysis before, but not to this extent. Once I knew my body went numb, I started to panic. I started to breathe heavily. It was unbearably longer than it should have been, and for me, it would have lasted around 30 seconds at most, and I haven't even experienced the large weight on my chest yet. That's what I was actually waiting for, and I guess my body was trying to prepare for it, because the dread was like a sharp knife point and it just kept jabbing me each passing second. Then I stopped breathing because what happened next made my heart stop and my blood run cold. In close proximity of my ear, I heard somebody say, "Hey." It sounded like a woman whispering into my ear. I was so disturbed, I tried to call for help. But I knew that I couldn't work because I couldn't even breathe out a syllable. I tried to break free of this invisible bind, but I gave up, and I knew I just had to rough through it. The next thing I know, something sits on my chest. But it wasn't the normal weight I would experience in these episodes. It was something lighter, that felt less aggressive. It felt like fingertips caressing across my chest in a sensual way, laying down on my right pec. It was followed by a leg wrapping itself on the front of my thighs. The next thing I know, the left side of my body was being weighed upon like someone would be cuddling up next to me. And just for the record, I don't have a girlfriend, and I doubt anybody in my house would start sneaking into my room at night. So I'm frightened and confused, and I still couldn't move. Then the voices of the woman came back and asked me what I was doing, in a very quiet, sincere tone. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to respond. So I calmly said, "I'm trying to sleep." That's when I noticed my face could move and my hands could move. But I refused to open my eyes because I didn't care to see what was there. The next thing I knew, the weight on my side began to diminish and I could move again. So I shot up, looked around the room, and nobody's there. My senses start to come back, and the sound of my computer comes back to me like it was never turned off. I didn't bother going back to sleep. I guess this is a wake-up call. I need a better sleep schedule. Probably need to change a few things. But my mind is still stuck on, was it a spirit? Was it a part of the dream I was having? And if it was a spirit, maybe it was just lonely. I don't know. I'm still confused, and I don't know what to think. I guess I'll just chalk it up to a hallucination and get on with my life. So, some exposition. This story takes place in northern Illinois, back in 2007-ish. I was about 16 at the time, and we had moved into a developing neighborhood that was up and coming. The land of the neighborhood was hilly, covered in woods, and led down to a small lake. Down by the lake, there were some houses that had been there for years and were separated from the company that built our place. The neighborhood was exactly what my family was looking for. The lots were sizable and not too close to each other, and most still harbored quite a bit of woods, perfect for maintaining some privacy and getting in touch with nature, all without being too removed from society. At least, that's how it was in our small cul-de-sac. At the time of this story, there was our home and 2 other houses on our road, one of those being the model home for the development company. Our cul-de-sac had emptied out into the main vein of the neighborhood, which was a steep, forested road without any street lamps, save for the one at the end of our street. It was a really neat road that led all the way down to the lake, and my family actually hiked it often. It made for a beautiful walk, despite its hills. We had been living there for about a year or 2. The details are fuzzy. When I had a weird, maybe mundane, or maybe paranormal encounter. Some further information. Sorry, we had 2 dogs, a boisterous, reckless, independent rat terrier named Belle, and a sheepish, shy, but very nosy Shetland sheepdog named Zuri. They were amazing dogs that I'd brought so much love and joy into our lives, but also some occasional stress. Zuri, the Sheltie, was a nervous dog and barked at her own shadow. She was very sweet and would not hurt a fly, but would certainly alert everybody about its existence. This habit of overreacting went terribly with Belle's tendency to find trouble. See, she was the most well-trained dog in the world. She was feisty, despite her size, and didn't back down from well, anything. She had a habit of concerning our previous neighbor's Great Dane if given the chance. And, although she never outright attacked anything, she was always acting brash and aggressive when it came to other dogs and wildlife. Even when people came into or near the house, she always had something to say, usually via loud barking. We didn't have a fence yet, therefore, letting the dogs out at night was something unnerving. Raccoons were something we saw occasionally, being in the middle of the woods. The thought of Belle tearing into a raccoon, completely ignoring my pleas for her to stop, was all too real. If she picked a fight with the wrong animal, it could really end badly. That fear was always in the back of my mind when letting her out. In all reality, I should have always leashed her, but she had a habit of not wanting to go when on the leash, and a majority of the time, nothing happened anyway, so I didn't. One of the ways I mitigated my risk is taking the dogs out the front door and letting them do their thing in the front yard. Our backyard was pretty wooded, but our front lawn was just grass and landscaping. From our porch, you could see the whole cul-de-sac. There was the house at the end of the loop, and then the model home at the start of the road. This illuminated by the lone street light. There were still woods in the lots across from us that Belle could zoom off into, though, which unfortunately, one night she did. She had her nose to the ground one moment, looking to do her business. Then the next, she was at full attention, glaring into the darkness, beyond before peeling off. Zuri, ever jumpy and always ready to bark at the smallest disturbance, made a commotion as I raced after Belle. I was frantically yelling, crying and begging for her to come back. I was ready to dive into the brush to rescue her, but instead saw her stomping along the tree line, hackles up, boastfully smelling for something. Whatever she had charged after had taken off. I scooped her up, scolded her, carrying her back home. I had been seriously shaken up after the entire ordeal because I hadn't seen her take off like that in a while. It was the following night. I was watching her like a warden. I was standing right next to her in the front yard, monitoring her for any body language that threatened that she was about to take off. Luckily, she usually was pretty obvious when she was about to charge. Both dogs sniffing around, taking their time, when I lifted my gaze to look around the night. It was early autumn, and the sound of wind rustling the trees was all around. Other than that, it was calm and quiet. I was studying the tree line along our cul-de-sac when my eyes finally found the model home, and thus the street lamp. That's when I saw it. My heart bludgeoned against my chest in a sudden jolt of terror, and I wrestled with disbelief, unable to process what I was seeing. There, lurching and shifting and lumbering along the road, as though the lamp was spotlighting it, was a pale, naked humanoid figure. I use those verbs, but they aren't exactly right. The way this thing moved defies common description. It was rough and sloppy, but yet eerily smooth and effortless. If anybody is familiar with Voldo from Soul Calibur, that is the closest example of its movements. It was easily over 6 feet, and the limbs too long for its body, which made its strange dance across the pavement all that more unsettling. I say dance because the way it moved was more akin to that than walking. It was gaudily flinging its arms forward, then heaving its legs after its leg arcs, clumsily, but defying fluid. As it lurked along, one glaring detail pierced my senses. It was devoid of any facial features. This thing, this swaying, white, sickly thing, had no face. Nothing at all. I continued to gawk in horror as the figure carried steadily along its route, passing right by our cul-de-sac and down the wooded, steep blackness of the main road that laid ahead. It never once seemed aware of me, but I was blaringly aware of it. And then, all too fast and violently, I remembered the little, argumentative, confrontational dog at my feet and her very nosy sister. I dove for Belle and swept her up. overcome with terror as my nerves were electrified. I bounded to the porch and opening the door to drop her off inside, shutting it in a snap. All I could think of was Zuri spotting whatever that was and barking, earning its attention. So I ran to Sheltie, and by some miracle, she was none the wiser to the visitor, just my alarmed state. I too picked her up and fled inside. My room was upstairs with a similar vantage of the cul-de-sac, and I sprang up the steps, daring to get one last glimpse of this naked, faceless creature. By the time I parted my blinds and pressed my face against the window, terrified but curious, there was nothing but street lamp against the inky dark. Whatever it was, it had now gone. I always let the dogs out in the backyard after that. Here's some theories. A possibility is that it was some streaker getting their kicks in. But there are a few problems with that explanation. First, this thing was white. Sure, possibly within flesh-toned white, but it would be very sickly pale if that were the case. Secondly, although the texture of the creature seemed flesh-like, it was too rubbery, almost shiny. I suppose they could have oiled themselves up, but it still seemed a bit too off to just be skin. The largest hole in this theory was the lack of genitals. I distinctly remember there being nothing in the groin area, and considering the whole point of streaking is showing off. That, and its lack of face. Streakers can't just take off their facial features like an article of clothing. This leads to my strongest theory. Someone running around in a white morph suit. This would mark all the boxes that didn't get checked in the streaker theory. But it still doesn't adequately explain everything. The uncanny length of limbs, the jarring, unnatural way it moved, and the insurmountable dread that seized me. But fear is an unreliable narrator, as that goes. So what do you all think? Weird but innocent thrill seeker, or something more paranormal? Just a few disclaimers. This was also pre-Slenderman times. If there were corners of the internet that discussed him, it certainly was not in the limelight yet. I have heard of the rake, although I don't feel it's a great match because the eyes are such a defining feature of that legend, and this thing definitely had no face. I don't think I remember any claws, other than from the blend of memories from comparing the thing to Voldo. One thing I will say is it could just because I was unnerved by what I saw, is that every year around autumn at that house, I felt a weird energy in the woods in our backyard. It would bother me enough to sometimes drive inside, despite one of my favorite things being swinging. That was enough to spook me on its own. But then I noticed the dogs would get tense at times too. That definitely always drove me inside, even during the day. Oh, and one more thing. I was relaying this story to my younger brother, and he reminded me that he had terrible nightmares for several years after we moved into that house, and his bedroom overlooked the woods in the back, and the dreams were so bad that he would come into my room, sleep on the floor some nights. Sure, it could have been very normal nightmares that all children get, but it does make you wonder with all the other context in place. He described the dreams as seeing a shadowy man-shaped aura that terrorized him, usually via chasing him. In most interesting dream he explained to me, the figure had picked up Belle and was taking her downstairs, stealing her away. That description does not match any naked slinking man, but both give off an airy mystery, a potential paranormal suggestion. Perhaps the Forest Service as a neighborhood before ours, and just a more spiritual variety. Regardless of who or what any of it all was, it was undoubtedly strange. When my family would visit my grandparents when I was only 5 to 8 years old, I was convinced that I'd see an outline of a person standing in the basement doorway at nighttime. Like, totally 100% sure there was a figure standing there, only it was much too dark to make out any of the features, and it definitely was not any of my family members. The figure was much too tall. Everyone else would be asleep on their guest beds, and I'd be lying there in the darkness, unable to move, because I was so afraid. I remember my nightgown being soaked with my sweat, despite it being freezing in the basement, like I was that terrified. Anyhow, my grandparents ended up moving out of that house, but even then, once in a while back home, I swear, I'd see a shadowy person peering around the doorway to my bedroom. Again, definitely not a member of my family, as the figure was much too tall. A few years later, I mentioned it to my grandfather, who jokingly said it was probably a dead soldier looking for his whiskey. When I was a teenager, probably 16, I began developing really bad insomnia. Our house at the time had 2 stories and a basement, and was just on over 2 acres of land. So, close to the neighbors, but far enough away that there wasn't much neighboring. It was dark outside, and the lighting from their house was far enough away. One night, I was home alone with my younger brother, while my parents and youngest brother were at a hospital with my dad, who at the time had just had surgery. My brother was asleep, and I was just starting to go to sleep, around 3 or 4 in the morning, when suddenly I heard heavy footsteps downstairs, and somebody walking back and forth. Naturally, I thought somebody had just broken in, and I was terrified. I determined that if I remained quiet, whomever broke in would just take some stuff from the main floor. We didn't have many valuables, and leave without risking waking anybody up. When day came, it turned out everything was fine, and nothing was taken. There was no trace of any intruder. Eventually, I got it over a month, and about a month or 2 later, I heard it again, and again, and again. Always between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., and always on the floor below me. My family doubted me because of the insomnia and my general sleep deprivation. One night, I was up really late with my mother, and we both heard it together. Not only that, but this time it was on the same floor as us. She just said, "No way. That's just Dad. I'll go look." When she came back, she looked surprised and informed me Dad was fast asleep. The validation was nice, but I would have preferred sleep deprivation hallucinations. Over time, the rest of my family would eventually hear it. We called it the poltergeist. It was never malicious, but one day, we found one of our hammers bent backwards, which was very weird. We set up a night vision camera, and eventually did capture the sounds on tape, along with what sounded like a glass set on the counter, and a heavy sigh. Unfortunately, we accidentally and stupidly taped over it when recording the Super Bowl. Mom, in all of her brave glory, once heard it in the basement and went down to tell it that it was dead and to go towards the light. If I recall, we really didn't hear it after that. When I was about 10, my grandpa died a day after Christmas Eve because of cancer. My grandmother and I turned off his phone, like really turned it off. It was some old Nokia phone, no touchscreen, just an old regular phone. We put it on a shelf and left it there. A week after his death, we heard an SMS tone of said phone. I was freaked out at this point because, well, it was turned off. I knew it. My grandmother took it down and gave it to me to open the text message, since she doesn't know how that works. So I opened it and gave it to her. The SMS, or text message, was from my grandpa to his own phone, and it read, "I arrived." Creepy as hell, The second story. When I was younger, I lived in a big house with different separated apartments, which belonged to my aunt. In there, I lived with my aunt, my grandmother, her medium friend, and a coworker friend of my aunt. The coworker brought her son with her. He was younger than I. The little boy woke up every night crying at the same time, so the medium had a talk with him. The boy said that there is a black man with a weird face in the room whenever he wakes up. The next day, the medium friend proceeded to cleanse the area, and I was watching her. She spoke at first calm, but then aggressive. I thought something happened, so I hid next, outside of the door at the wall. I always had a sense for weird stuff like this, and when I was little, I was feeling energy pretty strong at times. The medium later told us all that it was a demon hiding in this room. Now it's gone. Since the cleansing, the boy slept normally and without any nightmares. When I was between 6 to 10 years old, my mom and I lived in a house where I would be visited by something at night. It would always be preceded by a dream where I would be looking at a book in the back seat of a car, and all of a sudden, the words would start bleeding down the page. Was it a dream, or was I awake? As I would come out of the dream, I could feel a presence coming into my bedroom and looking at me. I would be awake with my eyes closed, terrified at what it could possibly be. I often felt like it was menacing. Eventually, I would fall asleep. Sometimes, though, I would scream out loud, and my mom would come in with a broom, saying, "Where is it?" trying to calm my fears. I used to stay home by myself as a kiddo, as my mom worked 2 jobs at the time. I would make jokes, looking at 2 Nintendo controllers, saying, "If there is something here, pick up the controller and play," acting like I was tough calling it out. Of course, when I would do this, rest assured, it would be there that night. We eventually moved out of that house, and all of these things stopped. Now, when I was much older, my mother would tell me that when I was younger, I would tell her, "You can't see them right now, but they are laughing at you." I don't recall saying that, but then again, I believe I may have repressed those memories. As an adult, I've told my wife about it. We both went back to that house, and she got out to go ask the current resident, who currently lived there, if they've experienced anything similar. She explained my story to the man who had lived there with his parents, since we had moved out many years ago. He had not. Well, once I got home from college, I started reading, and then went to bed. A normal night, I thought. So I dreamed that I'm drowning, and literally another person like me appeared in my dream. He just smiled at me and said, "You're going to die." Then I woke up, almost drowned. I wasn't breathing while I was sleeping, and I could not breathe through my mouth. I took a deep breath, went back to sleep. I literally could not stay awake, so I fell asleep immediately. Then I dreamed I was with a cousin in my room, and we were going to open the door. I couldn't reach the lock. He looked at me, smiled at me, told me, "You're going to die." I woke up again, and the procedure from before was repeated. I fell asleep again, and then in the dream, I'm with 2 friends, and I tried to talk to them, but they wouldn't listen. Then they saw me, smiled, and said the same thing. "You're going to die." I woke up again, but this time, I could not take a breath. I was literally not breathing. My entire body felt like it had tingles. You know, like when one foot falls asleep. only that it felt all over my body and hurt a lot. I also felt a loud ringing in my ears, as if my eardrums were going to break at any moment, and I also felt as if something was on top of me and it would not let me move. I clarify, not so believing, but I was in panic. So, I thought of my loved ones, and that I cannot die yet. I mentally said, God, get this demon out of me. And this is where things get unreal. I felt my body contorting. I heard the cymbal sound loudly, and then a light came out of my body, and finally, I felt like somebody had pushed me hard in the middle of my chest, and I didn't feel anything else. I was able to breathe again through my mouth. I turned on the light in my room, and there was blood coming out of my nostrils. That night, I did not sleep, and I just thought okay, this is the reason why I could not breathe. And I did not give any more importance to the matter. I was trying to convince myself that I had dreamed everything. And when it was time to go to university, I undressed, got in the shower, looked between my chest, and I had a pretty thick cut there. Something deep, since there was still blood coming out. That's when I realized that had not been a dream. Listen, I don't know. Maybe somebody was playing a Ouija board that night with my soul. I'll never know for sure. I have a book of these because of this very old, strange place that I grew up, way out in the Idaho mountains. Because of the length of this story, I'm only going to tell one. If anyone cares to know, I'll be happy to share. So, I was and am something of a skeptical believer, in that I fully believe there are things in this world, and beyond, that we cannot fully comprehend or explain. But I think most claims out there can be boiled down to just a lack of understanding of things and or a desire for what they experienced to be paranormal. People who want to see ghosts, so when there's a trick of the light, they simply see a ghost. This place of which I speak is not such a far-reaching delusion as that. I grew up here. My adopted father was a roofer and an outdoorsman, and overall, a really great guy. He had friends everywhere. I'll spare you the full-length story, because a good friend of his was dying of cancer. He was called upon to run to this secluded cabin rental hot springs resort up in the mountains when I was just 6. I had visited the place frequently, and with my brother and stepmother when we would bring us up fishing or camping or hunting. I loved it to find that we'd be staying there. Even though my time was split between him and my biological mother down in town, I still spent most of my childhood in those same mountains, since I was 6. Aside from just loving the place for all the freedom I had, catching frogs, climbing trees, playing in the woods, swimming in the river, I think there were very few nights that I wasn't awoken in the night by something in that cabin. I'd wake up to dark shapes looming over me in the darkness that would recoil as I woke up. The sounds of things falling and breaking in the night, but in the morning, there was nothing broken, or the sounds of somebody walking on an old, creaky old floor, but nobody being there. I was amazingly unfazed by anything. I knew everybody else experienced things, but almost nobody would talk about it. I never really pushed, though. I was a kid, and when the day came, I was back up to my normal kid things. There was a night, though, that I think everybody had to acknowledge the question that strange things did indeed go on. At the time, the cabin we stayed in was small. There was no additions made to it, so it was one large room, except the bathroom. One main bed where the old man and stepmom slept. I stayed on a couch, and my brother slept on a cot. There was a loft that you couldn't stand in that was just mostly used for storage, but we all slept in the one room. No one was brothers since we all came from near poverty anyway. It was this one night that we all awoke to screaming and the loud clattering of everything, including the lamp on my stepmom's nightstand, being thrown across the room. Everybody went up with a jump, and my old man turned on his lamp, and we just saw stepmom sitting up in the bed, eyes wide and pale. She was still yelling, "Where is it? Look for it." When we all collectively asked what she was talking about, she just sort of quieted down. She made it very clear she did not want to talk about it, and then it must have been a dream. But after we all cleaned up the broken stuff and laid back down to go back to sleep, no one believed her. I don't think anybody slept that night. Even the next day, we couldn't get out of her what she had seen at the foot of her bed that made her freak out the way she did. We all doubted it was a dream, though. She made it very clear she never wanted to talk about it and wanted everybody to just forget that it happened. And you almost could forget that it never happened. Not long after, she convinced the old man to build an extension on the cabin to give them an actual bedroom. I never forgot, though. There was this glass angel figurine that stood about 1.5 feet tall that she had gotten at a yard sale years prior that sat across the room on the old box TV we had that was broken when she threw her lamp across the room at whatever it is she saw. There was a lot of stuff broken by accident that she just threw out, but she had tried to fix the glass angel, and so it sat there pretty well fixed, actually, on top of the TV for years until after she died, as a constant reminder of that night to me. I'm a senior at a small liberal arts college in central Maine. Its forestry and ruralness give it a reputation of having an incredibly eerie feeling. Maine itself is a very old state, and my college is so old that we were founded when Maine was still a part of the state of Massachusetts, here in the late 18th century. Our campus, located in the town of Waterville, which some of you might be familiar with as the town in the 2001 released film, Wet Hot American Summer. Many people do not know Waterville is a real place, and is actually based on a real summer camp in Winslow, connected through a nearby river by a suspension bridge, which is where this incident takes place. The bridge connecting Waterville and Winslow is called the 2 Cent Bridge. It is one of the oldest cable suspension bridges in the United States, being constructed back in 1901. Maine suffered economically when much of the timber industry left the state. The bridge, 2 Cent Bridge, was originally constructed to serve workers who walked to work at the wood and paper mills across the river. I'm in my early 20s, and growing up, I was never a huge believer in the paranormal. While I wanted to believe, I felt I had to see something with my own eyes. While on the way back from my nightly hike across the bridge at around 8 p.m. on February 28th, I noticed a tall black figure, without any real facial features, about 50 feet in front of me. I originally thought this was a person. However, its blurry appearance resembled the version of the human caricature you'd see on restroom signs. The figure appeared to be wearing what resembled a construction hat. Without warning, this figure then aggressively sprinted with the force horizontally to the right. I expected to see the figure continue going down the path, but then it vanishes out of thin air. I was in shock. It was hands down the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. Just to give you some perspective on how skeptical I was about the paranormal at the time, I sat there on the ground 30 minutes after, repeating to myself, "I'll be darned, I was wrong." After doing some minute research on the area, I eventually named the figure Foster. Moses Foster was a mayor of Waterville in the 1800s who built the city hall, and the railroad bridge located next to the 2-cent bridge. Both were vital to the town's economy. However, the economy of Waterville still suffered. There was a dorm at the nearby New Hampshire boarding school, and I attended named Foster. I can't confirm that he was related to the dorm, but public records say he was a merchant in Maine and New Hampshire. I want to say I'm not scared to go back there. I'm still interested in a career in law enforcement, and there are real people who can hurt you, in my opinion, that are far scarier than any ghost. Okay, so this happened in 1999, I believe. I was just a little 5-year-old boy. I do believe I've posted about this before, but I can't find it originally. So here we go. When I was 5, we lived in this apartment building. My parents have always been believers in the paranormal, and this was my first serious brush with it. We moved into this place like in '98. My parents immediately started noticing things. This entity did not waste time in the slightest. The first night, my parents could not sleep, kept waking every 30 minutes, feeling like we were all being watched. Eventually, my mom's friend asked my mom to take her teenage daughter for a bit, as they weren't getting along. So, myself and my parents actually switched rooms. The teenage daughter of the friend did not stay long, and after she left, I remained in the bigger room. I was terrified of the dark, to the point where I had a nightlight. The bathroom light was on in the hallway, as well as having my blinds open, allowing the streetlight right outside to stream in as well. I'm lying in bed, and I cannot sleep for whatever reason. I couldn't really blame myself, as I was always having night terrors at the time. Suddenly, my room goes pitch black. Black enough that I couldn't really see my own hand in front of my face, even if I tried. Then, from my door, I see an even black figure with blood-red eyes start walking toward me. I guess maybe blood-red eyes isn't the best description. It was more like glowing red eyes, actually, from this black apparition. I screamed, my parents waking up, but probably assuming it's just another night terror calling to me. When I can't even get out a cohesive sentence, they tell me to go to them. My mom has told me repeatedly over the years that she still feels bad about this incident to this day. I pluck up the courage to bolt to them, running through the shadow, and as I do, it's ice cold. I get to my door, look back, and my room is now back to normal. Now, people have told me that they think it was just a dream. It wasn't though, because 10 or so years later, mine and my mom's cousin moves into an apartment building about a block away from our old place. One night, she wakes up and sees the very same figure standing between her bed and her infant son's crib. I have more stories about this place from my parents' point of view, if anybody is interested in wanting to hear more. For those who've been born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, and know of the many haunted locations, even yes, the Alamo itself. I've talked about my own paranormal experiences at the Alamo in this group before, but today, I'm here to talk about something far worse, the Menger Hotel, within a stone's throw of the Alamo, and is, like all other buildings within a close proximity of the Alamo, are sitting on a battlefield. So, you can imagine that a lot of the buildings are very haunted. But one stands out above the rest, and that's the Menger Hotel. Rumored to have been a hospital during both World Wars, and have residents commit suicide when it converted back into a hotel. You can imagine the level of activity is probably stupid high. In fact, I worked there in 2015 when I was just a freshman in high school. I worked as a janitor for only 1 month. When I got the job, I knew it was haunted, just not this level of intensity. Day 1 on the job. I was being trained by another senior janitor. We go to the second floor. Our job, well, mainly mine, was to clean out the sinks while he went back downstairs to go get some supplies for the elevator for us both to clean. Anyway, I was just putting the cleaning products away when I heard somebody clear their throat. I was thrown off guard because the bathroom was supposed to be closed, and I know for a fact nobody walked behind me. As I was facing the mirror a majority of the time, I also noticed that the presumed man who had been clearing his throat sounded very raspy. Like he was trying to gasp for air. So I hesitated for 5 seconds, deciding whether or not to say anything. Now, for starters, I'm fairly knowledgeable about the paranormal, and that was the main reason I wanted the job. Get paid while doing a little bit of ghost hunting. Sounds weird, I know, but that was my rationale. So I decided to make a bit of noise to invoke a response in case there was any actual movement of any kind. I mean, you never know. So I decided to make a bit of noise to invoke a response in case there was an actual person inside. But I knew there was not. I looked underneath the stalls. I saw no movement of any kind. So I just cleared my throat, walked away, or so was the plan. When I cleared my throat, I heard someone clear as day, as you would hear somebody talk and say, "You too?" I whipped around, and of course nobody. I gathered all my supplies, calmly walked out of there. But somehow my face was not matching my attitude towards this because when the senior guy came back, he coldly stated, "You heard him?" And I was just like, "I beg your pardon?" He comes back, repeats the same thing. So now I'm in this dilemma, whether to lie or not. So I'm just like, yes, I did. But when I cleared my throat, I heard someone say, "You too." The senior guy looked at me with a surprised look and said, "Well, that's a first." I didn't want to ask any questions, because I feared that any more talk of toilet ghost in there would attach itself to me. So we moved to the elevator, where my second thing happened. This time, the senior guy was there to witness it too. The door could not be manually opened and closed. No problem. Around the second time, the door closes. A hand goes in between the door, thus making the door open. However, there was of course no one there. Now, flash forward about 5 weeks in, and this is when things go off. I was working a graveyard shift. I'm in the basement, gathering supplies, minding no attention to anything else. Albeit, it may be reckless considering there were hazards galore down there. I figured since I've been down there many times, and that it's well lit, I was going to casually stroll along. That's when I met this entity that came around a corner. I almost ran through it, had I not seen it in my peripherals. I looked up, only to see a solid black mass with a faint white glow coming from where its eye should be. It then charged me, and I stumbled backwards, only to be met with something hard, hitting from behind, pinning me down to the ground. Luckily, I had my radio with me, and radioed for some backup. What had pinned me was a medium-sized wooden table. I was told that had it been a few feet higher, it would have crushed me to death. I did have a broken rib, so soon after recovery, I left that place as fast as possible. Didn't even bother putting in my 2 weeks. I don't ever wish someone to encounter whatever almost had killed me. And to this day, I refuse to step foot inside unless somebody else is with me. Some of you might find the contents of this story incredibly disturbing, and if you've checked out my Unearthing Stories channel, I've already told a good portion of it. But today, I wanted to tell you the entire story, sent to me from a man named Sam, who recounts his terrifying experiences on an accursed land down in Central Florida. These accounts by the eyewitness are 100% true and factual and did indeed happen. Without further ado, let's get into the story. This is titled, The Accursed Land. Back when I was 12 years old, my father decided to move us down around the mid-1980s from New York to his land that he had purchased back in the 1970s. About 23 or 24 acres or so of raw, forested land here in Central Florida. My sisters, of course, had all married young and were gone already, and my mother would stay up north, waiting another couple of years for her transfer in an insurance company job, and afterward planned to rent the house up there out. I have mentioned this to you before, and I explained that my father was very loving and affectionate to me. Often, after he came home from trucking over the road, he brought me gifts and toys and such. He loved me very much, since I was his only boy, and he had prayed for a son for many years, and finally, I came along, 7 years after the last daughter. His little last of the Mohicans, he called me. But after this Ouija board incident, as I talked to you about before, he became a very mean and abusive man. After my sisters had moved out, things seemed to die down a bit, and my mother and father seemed to get along better than ever. Or at least shortly after the last sister moved, things seemed to change once we got out to Florida. I was excited to go, since Florida was a well-known tourist tropical state, with many things to go do and see, like fishing and the beaches and Disney World and such. When we moved, everything seemed okay at first. We got along fine, and we moved into a used single-wide manufactured home that he had set up already. But in the future, he planned to build a bigger home and move that one towards the back of the property and rent it out. There was tons of work to do after we got there to tame the land. I spent every extra hour I had besides school, church, or sleep to work that land, and I was the primary muscle to do a lot of things since my father had had a bad back from unloading and fixing his trucks for many years. I'd say 6 months after we were there, things changed. I felt a heaviness in the air that was overly suffocating. I thought it might be the heat, but even in the cooler months like December and January, it always felt that way on the property. I experienced sleep paralysis often, even though that never happened to me up north, and nightmares. A few times, some type of force held me face down in the bed. Other times when I was asleep, I'd wake up in a panic and see something very dark and shadowy like in the corner of my room. My father's demeanor changed. He became very mean and cruel. He stopped going to church, and I had to get rides from a nice family to get there on Sundays. We eventually started an animal farm. Initially, everything seemed alright, but not long after, the animals began dying in very gross and painful ways. Horrific ways. Especially to a teen from up north who was green and had no experience with this. It seemed like all I did for years was bust my tail, clearing up trees he had cut down, and dodging coral and rattlesnakes while I did it, or burying animals in the back property that had died in all kinds of sick ways. Our chickens, even though we fed them very well, would constantly fight, kill, and cannibalize each other, eat their own eggs and chicks. Our rabbits, though well sheltered, would get the most awful skin diseases and die if they were not separated. They'd kill each other. Our pigs would break out and kill the chickens and eat them from time to time. Even seen them catch and eat snakes, and they fought with each other, making ungodly screams at times. I've seen our goats get sick and die, and squeal out a horrific death rattle that sounded like a human child screaming, then drop dead. goats and cows delivering babies in the night. We would go out there and find them the next day, with the baby stuck in the belly, only being had out, dead, with maggots and fire ants in its eyes and mouth. We would have to put them down. Our horses often got sick and died. One of them got caught up in the fencing in a horrific way one night and was technically strangled to death, tongue hanging out with horrific glazed-over eyes. It was a nightmare to say the least, which I endured till I was 20. Those years were so long and horrible, it felt like I was stuck there for 30 years. When my mother came down after a couple of years, nothing really changed. The old man had pretty much gone dark side, and they argued all the time. One time, he broke my dog's jaw with a hammer and took him for a ride. Another time, he killed my pet pig, who was supposed to be kept alive for breeding, and forced me to eat the ribs he cooked from him. Of course, I witnessed countless shootings of animals, things that had to go into the freezer, and I was force initiated into killing also. To make a man out of me, he said. But even though I did that kind of dirty work, I never really enjoyed doing it like he did. There was something in me that loved life and respected it still. I just learned to shut off my emotions and do as I was ordered when I had to. One time, I had dreamed one of the pigs got loose, and my dad shot at it wildly in the woods, not being able to catch it, and something moved me to jump behind the chicken coop, and the buckshot hit the metal siding, protecting me from being shot. Well, guess what? A week later, it happened, just as I had dreamed. The ungodly scream of that pig, though, when he finally shot it. The sound went through me like razor blades. Another time, my father's dog got loose and slaughtered my mother's prized white ducks, and she shot him. He was still alive, but she said she would not go closer to him. She feared getting bit, so I had to finish the job. My dad came home, and all hell broke loose, to say the least. He went out and shot up the backyard. Later at night, I woke up to an AK-47 to my head while in bed. He threatened to kill me and kill my mother and kill himself. I told him, "Dad, you can't do that. God will not let you do that. Please, go back to your room." My parents slept in separate rooms at this point, and he gradually lowered the weapon, going back to his room. Eventually, things simmered down, but I can't count the times I got senseless beatings. Even my mother went dark side one day and beat me with the broomstick until I vomited and said she should have gotten an abortion. Her face looked distorted, and I knew that wasn't really her, deep down in my heart. I knew I was her favorite. Over the years, the old man would go off on the handle over little to nothing. I got the belt. I got fist to cuffs. Bullets shot over my head. I got a 2x4 one time in my face and almost lost my front teeth. A shovel in the back of the head, and the most unique incident where he blowtorched my face for a couple of seconds while we were working on his tractor trailer. I had to scissor off my eyelashes in order to see. They had melted shut. It actually took a lot of years to pass for me to look back on that incident and actually laugh. I caught hell about that one at school, let me tell you. I mean, for weeks, walking around with no eyelashes and shaved eyebrows. The old man began to reek of sulfur. I kid you not. And a few times, I saw his eyes go black and his face shift. I even attempted suicide at 16, but God saved me out of that one. I should be dead, but it wasn't my time to go, and I survived. I won't say what I did. I don't want anybody else trying to do it. The year I got baptized, and even though I often felt numb and dead inside, because of all the abuse that I felt, an inner glow deep inside knowing that I was loved by something much greater than myself. That same thing was looking out for me, protecting me. But I must admit, before and up to the suicide attempt, I always felt this thick, oppressive cloud over and around me on that accursed land. There was great evil there, and I felt it all the time. But after my baptism, it wasn't too bad, and it was not felt when I was off the property. So I just learned to cope. Learned not to love or have pets since I had lost so many at that point. When we came there, my beloved black terrier mix, who had survived just fine in New York for 12 plus years, died as soon as we moved down there. My father found him in a ditch near our property, contorted with his tongue nearly bitten off. A snake killed him, most likely. My beautiful Belgian shepherd got heartworm and died. I told my parents he was fainting often, but they did nothing. And by the time they tried, because he would not get up one day, it was too late, and he had to be put down. Now when I think about it back then, the evidence shows we were not the only ones suffering in that area. Lots of people had animal problems too. There was rampant drug use, suicides swept under the carpet and ignored. Lots of strange illnesses like lupus, cancer, leukemia. All kinds of mental illness too. Even a woman at church had this strange hardening of the skin disease. My friend from school, who was older than me, died of leukemia at 23 years of age. And there were many others. Okay, now I will try and get into an explanation. All the years I was down there, I heard quite often that the area was hexed by Native Americans who had survived the wars against them in that land. According to history, real history, President Jackson ignored Congress during his time as commander-in-chief and did not want to give Florida to the native peoples. Congress felt the military had driven most of them so far south through warfare that they should be left alone. But Jackson refused and led the military down here to make war, and was successful, sending countless thousands, perhaps in the millions to their deaths, on the very legendary Trail of Tears. Also, historical accounts going back to the Civil War show that there was much fighting and bloodshed in this very area. Florida was the last state to hold out against rejoining the Union, and fought long after General Lee had already conceded the war. More proof of this is from my sister. I'll call her Tina, and her husband Carl. She has 2 kids, and Carl was their stepdad. They moved down here after I had left, and went back to New York, and eventually, I did a short stint in the military. The old man, reeking something terrible of sulfur or rotten eggs, I might add that day, and I had a very explosive final argument, and I drove my motorcycle straight up here, and stayed with one of my sisters. I did not come back. It was hell from Virginia on up, because it was raining chilly October rain. I had a full-face black helmet, a cheap waterproof hunting jacket, and pants, but the gloves and sneakers were not waterproof. I could barely feel my hands and feet after that, but they went back to normal after I made it up. Left with the clothes on my back and my last paycheck from my crappy temp job. Tina, after being down here, had nothing but trouble. Pets she had owned for years, dying left and right, disappearing, being found hung in a tree by vines or by their collars. Cats, dogs, rabbits, birds, turtles, fish, you name it. Or disease, and even one dog died of diabetes. One time, she found a big black rat snake in her birdcage that had consumed most of her pet finches, right inside of her house. One night, she also saw a shadow being gliding across the ceiling of her bed, and it smiled at her with serrated teeth and what looked like glowing red cat-slitted eyes. Now, here's the kicker. One particular night, she woke up to a presence in her room. She could see clearly because of her nightlight. She saw a fully dressed in blue Union soldier at attention near her bed, holding a rifle. He told her clearly, "I'm here to protect you, ma'am. Everything is okay. You can go back to sleep." She turned away, hiding under her blanket, and went back to sleep eventually. While there on the land, though, her health began to go downhill. My brother-in-law got diabetes too. My parents fought with her often, and my dad even physically assaulted her one night over a very big misunderstanding, beating her like a child, a grown woman in her late 30s. Eventually, my mother and father divorced. He cheated on her with a woman later diagnosed with AIDS, and she had had enough. She called me up in the army crying and told me what had happened and how she had to get tested and hoped and prayed everything would go well. I could not keep my head straight after I found out. I got into fights. I almost became a victim of Full Metal Jacket blanket party, which I had witnessed a Texan go through, who, amazingly, looked just like Private Pyle, aka Lawrence in the film. I was doing well, scoring well in the points, until a freak incident happened with a grenade blowing up a few feet away from me, and another bad incident on the rocket launcher range caused me to develop really bad PTSD. Believe it or not, I thought it was just severe anxiety or anxiety attacks at the time, not being properly diagnosed or seen by a doctor. I was well into my 40s, and after scanning the net, to finally realize I had all the textbook symptoms. After what I had already been through in my life, it didn't take much more to kind of send me over the edge. I began drinking and smoking a lot, leaving the base without permission, and eventually met with Jag and opted to get out early. A good thing too, or else my mother would be dead. I got home in time to help my father move to a new property, and during a bad argument with my mother, I saw the blood in his eyes when he went for his loaded gun, threatening to blow her head off. I got my mother off the property before he came back with a loaded .38 pistol. Once I got her down the road in her pickup, she left. I went back to him to talk him down. It took an hour or so, but he did calm down, and I finished moving him. He finally, after many years, opened up to me and admitted that he had something like a serpent coiled up inside of him, and the drugs and alcohol helped keep it from springing up into his head and taking over. In that state, he said that he could see what he was doing, but like on autopilot, in a nightmare that he could not stop. Time passed, and I heard my mom get threatening phone calls. He planned to hire somebody to kill her for taking his land. So, for the very first time in my life, I rose up against him, went to his house, and told him if he ever harmed my mother, I would kill him. He had never seen me like that before, and I actually saw fear in his eyes. He backed down, and I never heard any more threats and harassment from him after that. He died, a foul-smelling man who could barely avoid urinating on himself, at night, at the age of 66, on February 6th in the year 2006. Sad to say, the truth is, I was relieved. It was over. I didn't have to worry anymore. That was an evil put to rest. Or so I thought. After he died, my brother-in-law found him. It had only been 3 days, but in the Florida heat, it was not a pretty sight. Carl was told to go check on him due to Tina's intuition, and when my father would not answer the door, he broke in, headed to his room. When Carl pulled back the covers, the old man's face peeled off, being stuck to the blanket. His body bloated, discolored, and maggots were spilling out all over the bed. He ran outside, vomiting all over the ground. Eventually, my family all met for his funeral, and he was cremated and placed in a wall at a military burial site, since he had served in the military before he married my mother. Not too long after, Tina and Carl began to argue, nearly constantly. I had become a truck driver by this time, had a short marriage and divorce, moved into a summer home in Summerfield, but would visit from time to time. One time, I went to talk to Carl to reason with him, and when I got out of my car to go knock on their door, something struck me hard, right in the sweet spot. If you remember from the Ouija board incident, I almost had broken my back. After many years of hard labor on the property and unloading trucks, that was my weak spot, my lower spine. After I got hit, I felt electricity go through my chest and down through my legs into my knees. I grabbed the car handle to keep from falling face first into the dirt. After looking behind me, I saw nothing. I said a quick prayer, and after 5 minutes or so, I was able to get up and walk, and the pain subsided. I was going to leave, but my heart would not allow it. I felt it was my duty to try and talk sense into Carl for my sister. I willed myself to go knock on the door. Carl answered the door. He stuck his face in my face and began laughing with ink-black eyes and began babbling in some unknown language. After his insane laughter and apparently mocking me, he turns around, went into the kitchen, and got a soft drink out of the fridge. I said, "Carl, are you okay?" And he looks at me like nothing ever happened and just says, "Hey bro, what time you get here?" We didn't talk long after that. Safe to say, I skedaddled real quick and left and did not come back for a long time. When I did years later, I noticed his room smelled like my father's old room, and he lined up his personal items and knickknacks, cigarettes, lighter, and change on his dresser and night table, just like my old man used to. Freaky, to say the least. One time, he had fought with my sister, and she said his eyes went completely black during the argument. That situation was heavy, but seemed to lighten up over time when she began attending a church she liked regularly. Eventually, I went through my haunting in Summerfield experience and my nightmare in Louisville experience, which I have nicknamed affectionately Luciferville, but those are other stories. In spite of the nickname, I loved it up there, and there are many friendly, warm, and kind people out in Kentucky, and in that quaint little endearing city. I actually think often about moving back there someday, if circumstances allow it. That bad experience there, in truth, was focused around my fiancée, the people she associated with, especially on social media, and her neighborhood, not the whole city. Of course, I told you about the Facebook werewolf experience, but I have more to tell about my time there sometime in the future. The story of the accursed land is not quite done. After years with my fiancée, we separated, and even though I have visited her time to time, I eventually ended up in Georgia. I liked the people, but driving there was hell, especially going through the bumper-to-bumper traffic on the I-285 loop every single day in Atlanta. Things did not work out, so I talked to my mom and moved back down to Florida. I would think that after all these years, something had changed, or so I thought. I came back down, slept in my mother's guest bedroom, which was my old childhood room. My white Pomeranian, a gift from my sister in Georgia, stayed in a cage with my mother's dogs in the kitchen. For a couple of weeks, there weren't any problems, but the house had a dark feel to it. One night, I woke up feeling a lot of anxiety. I heard movement in the dark. I could see, though, because the moonlight coming into the room through the window. And I kid you not, the closet door opened up very slowly, making creaking sounds. Once it was open, I heard footsteps. It sounded bipedal, about the weight and size of, say, a 6-year-old kid, but I couldn't see anything. I was on the bottom mattress of the wooden bunk bed, set up with stairs to the top bunk. I heard this thing make footsteps and go up the stairs to the top bunk. It sat down and started squeaking the bed, like a little child would when they are swinging their legs to bounce their bottom up and down when they are restless. I was terrified. I could hear this thing, but couldn't see it. I prayed and prayed for it to go away, and it eventually After 10 or so minutes, the activity did stop, around dawn, and I was finally able to drift off to sleep. I woke up wishing I had dreamed it all, but I knew well that I had not. This experience of night terror happened 2 more times, 3 times in all. I had had it. I knew how my mother's mentality was, and didn't even try to bother saying anything to her about it. I went that week, signed up for some debt at a camper home dealership, got a used camper and dropped it about 100 feet near her house with my pickup truck and moved out. I eventually found a local trucking job driving rock trucks and figured I'd be all right. Well, I would not be all right. Not long after my mother called me at work one day, my beloved white Pomeranian, named Benjamin, died suddenly. I would leave him with my mother when I went to work. One day, he practically exploded with blood. My mother and her friend rushed him to the emergency vet hospital, but he didn't make it. The veterinarian even had no clue as to what killed him. He was perfectly healthy and happy up until that moment. My mother said that she could not believe so much blood poured out of one little dog's mouth and nose. Everybody loved Benji. He was the only dog that I had after many years that touched my heart, and now he was gone. 4 years old, and just gone. I was heartbroken after that. He was special, and everybody knew it. I called him Mr. Happy Face because he had this permanent smile like Mickey Mouse, red tongue and all, and the special gift to pick up anybody's heart in the worst of times. There were strange signs, too, before he died. Like, I dreamed he died beforehand, but I didn't believe it, and blew the dream off. Then, a coworker of mine named Benjamin, who looked like death warmed over, like one of those pale corpses-looking people on drugs, used to accost me often to talk about nonsensical things for no reason, asking silly, pointless questions he should have known the answers to, concerning our job tasks. That suspected meth head, with rotting teeth, only drove with the company a few months and left before my dog died, and I ended up driving his truck, which was a filthy mess that I had to clean up. I never saw him again, not even on the road. As time went by, I was talking to my sister Tina one day, and I found out that my sister Sarah and her husband, on a visit at my mom's house one night, saw my father's ghost in the middle of the hallway one night. They freaked out and booked it to a motel. Another time, my nephew from Georgia was staying in the guest bedroom and was creeped out by hearing small footsteps and giggling going up and down the hallway one night while in bed. Plus, he said that her little clown doll collection and owl pictures in the room creeped him out. I definitely agree. Eventually, my mother opened up to me, and often, she felt something brushing her leg at times, and some nights, she felt some big man sit down on the side of her bed. She felt it was my father. One time, she yelled and commanded what she thought was my father by his first name to leave, and don't come back, and the activity stopped. After many years of study, in my opinion, that was not him. Just the entity that was parasitically using him, called a familiar spirit. One night, I woke up to hear a bipedal thing, about the size of a child, run across my camper roof and leap off of it. It sounded like it was messing with my air conditioner. The AC never ran right after that. It rattled, and it was hard to sleep with it on, and it kept having black mold breakouts in it. I began repeatedly having mold breakouts all over my camper too, got quite sick, and even missed 2 weeks of work. Eventually, the unit blew entirely, and so I bought a new one. Often, at about the witching hour, I would get knocks on my door. 3 knocks. But every time I turned on the lights and answered, there was nobody there. One time, I was on the phone discussing spiritual warfare with my fiancé when something big banged into my window and began howling and screaming. It sounded like a cross between a child and a baboon. It was unholy. Never heard anything like that before in my life. I was terrified, and I did not open the blinds to see what it was. But later on, after some walks on the property, I heard some similar sounds and saw a huge, intimidatingly large type of owl, which had taken up residency in one of our trees. This owl had ink-black eyes and harassed me often at dusk, and at around 3 a.m., the so-called witching hour, with its god-awful voice. Lots of harassment from black crows, too. One night, I woke up to see a wraith at the foot of my bed. I freak out, start fly-kicking at it with my right leg, and yelling, and it vanished. I was covered with sweat, and stayed up until the sun came up. It looked like a grim reaper with no sickle. Numerous times the window was banged in the middle of the night, waking me up. One morning, the crack of dawn, I awoke to my camper being violently shook back and forth like a ship at sea. When it stopped, I looked out the window to see a pack of pigs running away. One of them, just one, stopped and looked back at me directly in the eyes and was smirking at me. My neighbor's pigs had broken out of their pen, but there was no reason for them to surround the camper like that, since there was no food for them, or even roots. Just dirt under the camper. It reminded me of the account of Christ casting legion into the pigs. Extremely creepy and shocking, to say the least. Finally, after another sickness, I decided to do a house blessing, but I knew it was risky since, in truth, the entire land needed cleansing, and many cursed objects should have been removed from the homes, which were many, since my mother rented several single wides at the time, and my sister, cousin, and aunt had double-wide homes on the land too. It should have been done with a family group prayer together as a team, but I know they wouldn't be of much help, and were far too attached to their household idols to do a proper cleansing. It was dangerous because I could really anger these entities or imps, whatever you want to call them. I opted to do it, and did a prayer blessing over my camper, blessed olive oil in prayer, and anointed the roof and 4 walls and windows and doors. The activity against me began to die down, but eventually cranked back up in the form of nightmares. 2 years of that went by. Nightmares about fighting bigoted gangs of men who wanted to hang me, lynch me, or gangs of robbers dressed in black. Even gangs of women who resembled prostitutes, trying to assault me and violate me. I even had a realistic nightmare about these reptile frog humanoid type creatures attacking me. And always, I would wake up feeling like hammered, and like somebody beat me up from the inside out. Eventually, I began anointing my head with blessed olive oil before I slept. I woke the next day, nightmare-free, but my forehead had this burning sensation. I think something tried very hard to penetrate my mind, but the oil kept it out. The nightmares had stopped after I began doing that. So far, that is the situation at present. It's been held on here, and if the opportunity arises, I will try and leave. Currently, I'm trapped in this accursed place because of the hell I've been through in 2020, and not due to the virus. I've had a lot of bad luck. I was also terrorized by the black triangle UFO chasing me in the woods in one of the last stories, and had severe back injury again, and now I've been out of work for over a year. I got a lawyer to get me lawyer's comp settlement for my job and would have been barely surviving since and have had to apply for welfare. This last injury has been very bad, and I don't think I will ever work again. Other debilitating health problems have now popped up. Pain, along with some tumors, severe chronic fatigue and shortness of breath. So I don't know where this is going quite yet. Suicide has often crossed my mind, but I know better than that after what happened when I was 16. I know this is long, but I had to tell all my experiences of this land, and there is no easy way to do it except tell all that I can remember. My name's Bree. I'm a 21-year-old female, and I live in a small town in northern Ontario. The stories I'm about to share all took place in a house that my family and I had lived in until I was about 13 years old. None of these stories are in chronological order, due to how young I was when they took place. The first story I'll share with you was with my younger sister Mac, who is 2 years younger than I, and at the time, I was about 6. We were playing outside one hot summer's day. The wind was blowing particularly hard, and our mother was watching us from inside the house. To give a visual of the layout of our home and yard, our house was known as the backwards house, due to the fact that it was simply built backwards. So, our mother was able to watch us while washing dishes in the kitchen. There was also a massive hedge separating our house from the neighbor next to us, and a considerable distance between the hedge and our home. My sister and I were not playing any game in particular now, just running around, having fun like kids do. And suddenly, out of nowhere, me and my sister freeze like statues. We both look at each other and simultaneously looked at the space between our home and the hedge. To our surprise, there was a woman there. She was wearing a beautiful, long green flowing dress, had equally beautiful long wavy red hair, and had very fair skin and complexion. She seemed to float rather than walk, and seemed fixed on where she was going. As quickly as we noticed her, she vanishes into the basement wall on our home. My sister and I then looked back at each other. I didn't want to say anything to her at first, because my sister was known to copy me. I didn't want her to say she saw something, just because I had. After a few seconds of silence, though, my sister, with tears in her eyes, said, "Did you see that?" And all I could muster out was, "Uh-huh." We then ran to our mom, sobbing that some lady had just floated into our home. My mom, not wanting to scare us, said, "Maybe it's your guardian angel, stopping just to make sure you're okay." That did seem to ease our nerves, and we were soon back to playing around. As I got older, the experiences in the home seemed to become more sinister. My bedroom had been moved into the basement, and I remember regularly seeing a dark shadow crouched in the corner of the bedroom at night. I had nightmares every other night, and a constant feeling of being watched all throughout the house. My mother would later admit to me that once we had moved out, that she was afraid to even walk around the house at nighttime, in fear of something being around the corner. Another story that I remember vividly involves my brother, who is 7 years younger than me. My brother Gio at the time was about 2. We were sleeping together. It was very late at night, and for some reason, I could not fall asleep. To this day, I don't know if he woke up or said this in his sleep, but out of nowhere he says, Bree, do you see it?" "See what?" "The eyes." "What eyes?" I asked, to which he points behind the door. Obviously, at this point, I'm literally pooping bricks. I tried getting him to repeat what he said, but there's no reply. I quickly picked him up, brought him to the living room with me, where we both slept on the couch. You know, I have many other stories about this house, but I'll end it on this one. I remember somehow I had built up the courage to finally play downstairs by myself. I had my littlest pet shops in my toy room that attaches to the laundry room, and also my dad's workshop. I had set up all my little buildings in a circle and made a little pretend toy town. I was sitting right in the middle of it. And at this point, this happens to me. I was sitting, facing the houses that were lined up against the wall, in kind of a loose circle. The light in the room I was playing in was placed above and behind me. So, if somebody walks in that room, a shadow would be cast on the wall I was facing. So, as I was playing, I had this overwhelming urge to look up. When I did, I witnessed a shadow move from the right to the left of me, heading out the door into the rec room. My first thought was, well, maybe my dad was in his workshop, and I didn't know. So I look up and out the door, and there's no one. I look back down at my toys and realize that my dad's a bigger guy, and I would have heard him walk. And I definitely would have seen him in the time I saw the shadow to looking out the door. Needless to say, I book it up their stairs, get out of the basement. Long story short, but I'm happy we moved into the house we're in now, and out of that. About 2 years ago, a couple of friends and I decided to sneak into an abandoned asylum in Downey, California, after nightfall. We noticed a security guard doing his final rounds and waited for him to leave the premise. Once the coast was clear, we approached the surrounding fence, jumped over it to get onto the property, and as soon as we did, we all experienced something that I can only describe as a very unpleasant and heavy feeling. All the windows and doors were boarded up, from the outside at least, but we made our way around the building and discovered an entrance that had been broken into. So we make our way in and ended up in the auditorium. There were medical records scattered all over the floor of every room. One of my friends picks up one, and it caught his attention. It was a file from 1889. I don't recall the name of the patient, but he said that this patient had a mental disability, similar to what we now refer to as Down syndrome. It also had a list of treatments that had been performed on him over the years, ranging from shock therapy, induced vomiting, to being forced to consume mercury pills. As we continued to explore the halls, we felt as if we were being watched, and it got to the point we weren't comfortable being inside here any longer. As we made our way back outside, I heard a faint whisper, and what felt like a hand brushed the back of my head. I quickly looked back, but nothing there. So we ran out of there as fast as we could, jumping the fence, making our way back to the car. Thought nothing of it. We were honestly just relieved to be out of that thing. The following night is when things really took a turn for the worst. I went to bed right around 9 p.m., woke up right around 12:25 in the morning, to the feeling of somebody tugging on my leg. I have a tendency of falling asleep with the TV on, so when my dad gets home from work around midnight, he does his usual routine check to make sure my TV is off. So I'm waking up, thinking I'm about to get lectured about leaving the TV on again. But as I look towards the doorway, I see that the door is open and the hallway light is on. But there's no sign of my father, and I then begin to feel the pressure on my leg again. So, quickly, I turn my attention to the foot of my bed, and that's when I saw it. A solid, black, faceless silhouette, crouching over me, and it has a firm grip on my leg. I immediately freeze up, unable to move, and everything around me goes silent. All I could hear was what I can only describe as static, as it begins making its way up to my face. Immediately, I began to pray. Within seconds, its grip on me became weaker, and I was able to manage to bang my fist on the wall in order to try and desperately get somebody's attention. Within seconds, it was gone. I jump up, ran out of my room, and as I turn the corner, I bump right into my dad, who managed to be coming down the hallway, heading to my room. He said he had heard me hit the wall and was coming to see what was going on. I explained everything to him the best I could, and of course he ruled it off as a bad case of sleep paralysis. But I know for certain that was not the case. I've had sleep paralysis many times before, and this experience was nothing like it was when I was fully awake and that attack took place. I feel that whatever this was that I came across in the asylum the previous night had followed me home and was now making me aware of its presence. So, when I was little, I lived in this danky little apartment. I lived on the bottom floor, and there were 3 bedrooms. When you walked into the apartment that I lived in, you were instantly greeted by the living room, with the kitchen to the left of you. After walking afterwards a bit from the living room, you'd come to a small hall where the bedrooms were. To the right was my grandmother's and I's room. To the left was my stepsister and brother's room. My stepsister's room was left of the hallway, while my brother's room was straight in. And this is slightly important information. So, anyway, from what I can remember, nothing really ever actually happened in that apartment building, besides 2 things. The one I'll be telling is of the time that I had seen this little girl inside my brother's room. So, moving forward with the story, it was late at night, probably about 8 p.m. when I decided to go into my brother's room to just kind of chill a bit, since it was nice and cool in there most times. Without turning the lights on, I walked in, looked onto his bed, and now, right in front of his bed, is an old box TV that was currently turned off, with the light from the outside the room shining in on it. I look onto the bed, ready to just flop onto it, before I noticed this small figure of this girl. She had long hair that went all the way around the bed, and a dress of sorts. Her skin appeared gray, all black and white-like. At this moment, I was frozen as I stared at her, too terrified to move. I think I'd actually stopped breathing. I noticed she was staring at the TV and glanced over to it, expecting to see her reflection in it, but I did not. After that, I had quickly noped myself out of there, hiding in my sister's room for about 5 minutes, before going back to check on her. She had up and vanished. I remember at this point that I made a little game, almost. I'd walk into my sister's room, then check my brother's room. Each time she'd either appear or disappear. Now, this went on for a while, and it was actually pretty fun. Though soon I got the idea to try and talk to her, so I mumble a hello? Of course, I get no response. After that, I just kind of leave. Not sure how to interact with her anymore, but also feeling extremely happy. Like I had just made some random ghost girl's night by simply playing what a basically peekaboo with her. I still smile at the thought of that, thinking I had accidentally made a ghost girl's night by just going in and out of 2 rooms for about 20 minutes. Though, sometimes I worry if she's ever lonely. I wish I could check up on her, but it's not as crazy as you think. Even if it is to go check up on an old friend that I'd accidentally made years ago. Whatever.